That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the pines like a fragile promise, the kind that breaks under the weight of winter's indifference. Elias Thorne, the ranger who'd patrolled these woods for 15 years, stepped out of his cabin at dawn, his breath fogging the air in slow, deliberate clouds. The reserve stretched out before him, a vast expanse of snow-dusted evergreens bordering the edge of the rural town of Eldridge Hollow. It was a place where highways faded into gravel paths, and the hum of distant engines was the only reminder of the world beyond. Elias zipped his jacket higher, the cold biting through the worn leather, and slung his pack over one shoulder. Another day of checks, trail markers, poacher signs, the quiet vigil over animals that didn't know his name, but sensed his presence in the rustle of leaves. He'd chosen this life after the city chewed him up, after a divorce that left him hollow, after nights staring at ceilings that felt too close. Out here, the silence was a balm, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. The white tigers of the reserve were his unspoken charges, rare ghosts in a world that hunted them to shadows. He'd seen them from afar, the mother tigress with her piercing blue eyes, gliding through the underbrush like mist-made flesh. They weren't his to tame, but he watched over their territory, reporting sightings to the vets in town, ensuring the fences held against the curious or the cruel. That morning, as he trudged toward the eastern trailhead, a faint rustle pulled him from his thoughts. It came from the tree line, soft but insistent, like paws testing the snow. Elias froze, hand instinctively dropping to the radio on his belt. Poachers? No, the sound was too light, too hesitant. He scanned the white-blanketed forest, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Then, from behind a cluster of boulders, it emerged, a white tiger cub, no larger than a border collie, its fur stark against the grey dawn. The cub's eyes, wide and sapphire blue, locked onto his. It staggered forward a step, then another, its tiny body trembling not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. Flakes of snow dotted its coat, and its ribs pressed visibly against the pale hide with each labored breath. Elias's heart stuttered. A cub this young, alone? Impossible. The reserve's tigers didn't wander this close to the human edge, not without reason. He knelt slowly, keeping his movements steady, his voice a low murmur. "Easy there, little one. What are you doing out here?" The cub didn't flee. Instead, it tilted its head, ears flicking at the sound of his words, and took another faltering step toward him. Its paws left shallow prints in the snow, each one a testament to its weakness. Elias's mind raced, orphaned, separated in a storm. The mother could be anywhere, injured or worse. He glanced back at the cabin, a quarter-mile away, then at the radio. Protocol demanded he call it in, alert the vets, secure the area. But as the cub inched closer, its breath coming in shallow huffs that misted the air between them, something held him back. The raw vulnerability in those eyes, the way it pressed on despite the cold seeping into its bones. He extended a gloved hand, palm up, and the cub sniffed the air, nostrils flaring. It didn't touch him, but it didn't retreat either. Elias's throat tightened. In all his years, he'd never seen one this bold, this desperate. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he whispered, more to himself than the animal. The cub let out a soft, mewling sound, not a roar, but a plea that echoed in the stillness. It followed him then as he stood and backed away slowly toward the trail, its small form mirroring his path with uncanny determination. By the time Elias reached the ranger station, a squat wooden building at the reserve's perimeter, The cub was trailing him at a distance of 10 feet, weaving through the underbrush like a shadow. He radioed in, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "This is Thorn. Got a situation on the East Trail. White tiger cub, juvenile, following me, looks half-starved. Need backup." The response crackled through. Dr. Lena Hargrove, the reserve's lead veterinarian, her tone clipped with concern. "A cub? Alone? That's not right, Elias. Keep your distance. Could be stressed, aggressive. I'm sending a team. ETA 20 minutes. He acknowledged, but as he leaned against the station's porch railing, the cub emerged from the trees and collapsed at the edge of the clearing, its chest heaving. Elias's breath hitched. Up close, the cub's fur was matted in places, not with blood, but with the grime of a long, solitary trek. Its eyes never left him, pleading in that silent way animals had, a look that stripped away pretenses and laid bare the instinct to survive. Word spread quickly through Eldridge Hollow, a town of weathered faces and whispered doubts. At the diner on the highway's edge, folks gathered over coffee, steaming in chipped mugs. Old man Harlan, who'd lost a dog to a bear years back, shook his head. "Tiger cub! Dangerous business. Ought to put it down before it gets ideas." Beside him, Sarah Klein, the nurse from the clinic, frowned into her cup. "It's just a baby. Lost, probably. But out here, folks get hurt helping strays." The wildlife photographer Jax Reed, who'd been passing through on assignment, scrolled through his camera, already framing shots in his mind. Beautiful creature, but nature's not kind. Interfering could doom it more. Elias ignored the chatter when he stopped for supplies later that morning. The cub had stayed put at the station, too weak to follow further. Its breaths ragged against the wind. He carried a bowl of water and scraps of meat from his stores, placing them just beyond its reach. It watched, unblinking, as he retreated. That small act hung in the air between them, a bridge built on instinct, fragile as the morning frost. As the vet team arrived, engines rumbling to a halt in the distance, Elias knelt once more. The cub's eyes met his, and in that moment, the world narrowed to the space between man and beast. He didn't know then why it had chosen him, why its paws had carved a path through the snow to his door. But as Lena approached with her kit, gloves snapping into place, Elias felt the first crack in his guarded heart. The cub's struggle wasn't just survival, it was a call, echoing the quiet losses he'd buried deep. The cold deepened as the sun climbed, casting long shadows over the reserve, and in the silence, the cub waited, its presence a question no one had yet answered. The vet team's truck ground to a stop in the clearing, tires crunching over the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight. Dr. Lena Hargrove stepped out first, her boots thudding against the frozen earth. Medical kit slung over one shoulder like an old friend. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that had seen too many seasons of loss in these woods. Poached carcasses, orphaned fawns, the quiet deaths that came with the territory. Behind her came two assistants, young and wide-eyed, carrying a portable enclosure and tranquilizer gear. The air hung heavy with the scent of exhaust, mingling with pine. The distant hum of the highway, a faint underscore to the unfolding scene. Elias stood from his crouch by the porch, wiping his gloved hands on his jeans. The cub hadn't moved since collapsing, its white fur blending into the snow-dusted ground, rising and falling with breaths that were too shallow, too ragged. Its eyes, those piercing sapphires, flicked toward the newcomers but returned quickly to Elias, as if he were the only anchor in this intrusion. "She's holding steady," he said, voice low, keeping his distance to avoid startling it. "Hasn't eaten the food I left." Lena nodded, her face a mask of professional calm, though her gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she assessed the cub. "Good call, not approaching. White tigers are rare enough here, escapees from a breeding program up north, most likely. This one's malnourished, dehydrated, could be days without her mother." She knelt at a safe remove, pulling on fresh gloves, her movements deliberate, like a ritual to ward off the wild's unpredictability. The assistant set up the enclosure, the metal clinking softly in the cold air, each sound drawing a faint twitch from the cub's ears. From the tree line, the reserve's vastness watched in silence, a world of shadowed hollows and frozen streams where the tigers roamed unseen, their territories marked by invisible lines of instinct. Eldridge Hollow lay just beyond, a cluster of clapboard houses and a single main street where pickup trucks idled against the chill. The town had always viewed the reserve with a mix of pride and suspicion, a draw for tourists snapping photos from afar, but a reminder of dangers that didn't respect fences. Elias had heard the murmurs before, folks like Harlan at the diner, quick to label any wild thing a threat. That cub's mama probably ditched it for a reason, Harlan had grumbled once over fence repairs. Nature knows best. Leave it to sort itself. But Elias couldn't shake the cub's gaze, the way it had followed him through the snow, paws sinking with quiet determination. As Lena inched closer, syringe at the ready for a mild sedative, the cub let out a soft, wheezing chuff, not aggression, but a sound laced with exhaustion, like wind through dry leaves. Its body tensed, muscles rippling faintly under the pale coat, but it didn't rise. Elias's chest tightened. He'd seen that look in other animals, the ones that fought invisibly against the fade. He stepped back to the porch, leaning against the railing, the wood cold through his jacket. Silence stretched between them all, broken only by the rustle of Lena's kit and the cub's labored inhales. The photographer, Jax Reed, arrived unannounced, his SUV pulling up with a gravelly whine. He'd caught wind from a radio scanner, always chasing the shot that captured the raw edge of wilderness. Tall and lean, with a camera dangling from his neck like a talisman, Jax nodded to Elias before raising the lens. "Mind if I document this for the record? Could raise awareness for the reserve." His voice was even, but his eyes held a flicker of calculation, weighing the image against the moment's fragility. Elias shrugged, too focused on the cub to argue. Jax knelt, shutter clicking softly, capturing the tigress's form against the white expanse. Vulnerability, framed in frost. As the sedative took hold, the cub's eyelids drooped, its body slumping into a deeper stillness. Lena and her team moved in then, swift and coordinated, wrapping it in a thermal blanket that crinkled like whispers. They lifted it gently into the enclosure, the cub's weight light as a promise unkept. Elias watched from the sidelines, hands clenched in his pockets, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. Up close, the matting in its fur revealed patches of chilled skin, and a faint tremor ran through its limbs, even in sedation. A silent battle against the elements that had driven it here. Back at the reserve's rehab center, a low-slung building on the forest's fringe, the team worked under fluorescent lights that hummed like distant bees. The air smelled of antiseptic and hay, the walls lined with charts of migration patterns and recovery stats. Lena examined the cub on a padded table, her hands steady as she checked vitals, heart rate erratic, temperature dangerously low. "Hypothermia's the immediate threat," she murmured to her assistant, who nodded, prepping fluids. "And whatever drove her out, stress, separation. Whites like this are skittish. She's been through hell." Elias paced the outer room, the linoleum squeaking under his boots. He'd followed the convoy, unable to let go of that following gaze. Through the observation window, he saw the cub's chest rise and fall under the blanket, eyes half open now, unfocused but searching. Jax lingered too, camera set aside for once, his usual detachment cracking as he watched. "Seen a lot out here," he said quietly to Elias, "but this, it's like she's chosen you. Cubs don't trail humans unless they're desperate." The words hung, stirring something in Elias, a memory he'd long suppressed. Years ago, before the divorce, Before the city spit him out, he'd lost a child in utero, a quiet grief that had turned him to these woods for solace. Animals didn't judge. They just survived. He shook it off, focusing on the glass. The cub stirred weakly, a paw flexing as if reaching, and Elias's breath caught. In that instant, the room's hum faded, leaving only the rhythm of her struggle. Outside, as dusk bled into the sky, the reserve's edge blurred with gathering shadows. Snowflakes began to drift again, soft as forgotten promises. Lena emerged, pulling off her gloves. She's stable for now, IV fluids, warmth, but she'll need monitoring. And Elias... She keeps looking toward the door, like she's waiting for something, or someone. Her eyes met his, a silent question in the dim light. He nodded, throat tight, and stepped closer to the window. The cub's eyes found him through the glass, locking with that same pleading intensity. No roar, no threat, just a quiet insistence that pierced the silence. In the hollow quiet of the center, Elias felt the weight of it, not just a rescue, but a mirror to his own buried losses. The cub's presence demanded more than protocol. It called for the kind of compassion that risked cracking open old wounds. As night deepened, engines cooled in the lot and the first stars pricked the sky. The cub slept fitfully, her breaths evening out, but Elias lingered, the bond forming in the spaces between words, in the unspoken plea that echoed his own silent vigil. The why of her following remained a shadow, but in the cold clarity of the evening, he sensed it drawing nearer, inevitable as the dawn. The rehab center's lights buzzed faintly through the night, casting elongated shadows across the linoleum floors that stretched like veins through the building. Elias hadn't left after Lena's update. Instead, he claimed a worn chair in the observation lounge, the kind with cracked vinyl that stuck to his jeans in the humid warmth. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, carrying the scent of snow and distant pine, while inside, the air held the sterile tang of medicine laced with the earthy musk of the cub's enclosure. He stared through the reinforced glass, where the white tiger lay curled on a bed of heated blankets, her small form rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too fragile for the wild she'd come from. Hours passed in that vigil, marked only by the occasional creak of the building settling or the soft pad of Lena's footsteps as she checked charts in the adjacent office. Elias's mind wandered to the empty cabin waiting for him, its silence a mirror to the one he'd built around his grief. The miscarriage had been a quiet theft, no dramatic hospital scenes, just a doctor's measured words and a world that moved on without pause. He'd fled to Eldridge Hollow seeking distance from that ache, patrolling trails where loss was part of the cycle, not a personal scar. But the cub's eyes, even in sleep, pulled at those threads, unraveling the careful knots he'd tied. Dawn crept in grey and reluctant, painting the reserve's edge in muted tones. Elias rose stiffly, joints protesting the night's immobility, and pushed through the door to the treatment room. Lena looked up from her coffee, steam curling like the cub's breath in the cold air outside. "You stayed," she said simply. No judgment in her tone, just the quiet acknowledgement of shared burdens. She was a widow herself, her husband lost to a logging accident years back. The reserve had become her anchor too. Vitals are improving, fluids are helping, but she's still weak. No signs of injury, though, just exhaustion and cold. He nodded, approaching the enclosure with the caution of someone who knew the line between help and harm. The cub stirred at his footsteps, her head lifting with a slow, deliberate motion. Those sapphire eyes found him immediately, unblinking, as if she'd been waiting through the dark hours. She shifted, paused, flexing against the blanket, a soft chuff escaping her throat. Not distress, but recognition, like the rustle of leaves she'd followed him through. Elias knelt at the wire mesh, his gloved hand resting inches from the barrier. "Morning, little shadow," he murmured, the words barely audible over the hum of the heater. Her ears perked, tilting toward his voice, and she inched closer, nose pressing against the mesh in a tentative sniff. Lena watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her expression a mix of professional detachment and something softer, unguarded. "She's bonding to you, Elias. Unusual for a tiger, even a cub. Whites are more elusive, bred in captivity, but with that wild edge. If her mother's gone, poachers maybe, or a territorial fight, she's imprinting on the first safe presence." She paused, glancing at the monitors beeping steadily. "But bonding cuts both ways. You get attached, and if she doesn't make it—" The words trailed off, heavy in the quiet room. Elias didn't respond, his focus on the cub's slow blinks, the way her tail tip flicked in rhythm with his breathing. Outside, the reserve stirred, a distant bird call piercing the frost, the crunch of tires as Jax Reed's SUV pulled into the lot. The photographer had returned, camera in hand, his boots leaving wet prints on the threshold. "Heard she pulled through the night," Jack said, voice low as he peered through the glass. "Got some shots from yesterday, the way she looked at you in the snow. Raw stuff." He fiddled with his lens, but his usual brisk energy faltered, eyes lingering on the cub's form. Jax had his own ghosts, a failed expedition in Asia where he documented a tiger poaching ring too late, images that haunted his portfolio more than they sold. Word of the cub rippled through Eldridge Hollow like frost on a window pane. At the clinic where Sarah Klein worked, patients murmured over checkups, their fears mingling with reluctant curiosity. "Ranger Thorne's got a death wish, keeping that thing close," one farmer grumbled, rubbing a bandaged hand from a recent fence mishap. Sarah, wrapping a child's sprained wrist, bit back a reply. She'd seen strays before. Dogs dumped on highways, cats with eyes like shattered glass, and the pull to save them never faded. But tigers? That was a different weight, a moral ledge where one wrong step meant claws or regret. Back at the center, tension coiled as the morning wore on. The cub's temperature spiked suddenly, her breaths quickening into shallow pants that fogged the enclosure's air. Lena rushed in, stethoscope cold against the pale fur, her face tightening. "Infection setting in, maybe from exposure. We need to get antibiotics in her system, but she's fighting the IV." The assistants hovered, one holding a muzzle, while the other prepared the dose. Elias stood frozen, heart pounding against his ribs, the room narrowing to the cub's widening eyes. She pressed against the mesh toward him, a low whine threading through her chuffs, her body trembling not from cold, but fever's grip. In that suspended moment, Elias acted on instinct, slipping off his glove and extending his bare hand through a safe slot in the barrier. "Protocol be damned. It's okay," he whispered, voice cracking like thin ice. "I've got you." The cub's nose brushed his fingers, warm and urgent, her tongue flicking out in a hesitant lick. The contact was electric, a spark bridging species, her trust a fragile thread in the chaos. Lena paused, syringe in hand, tears glinting unspoken in her eyes. Elias, that might calm her. The dose went in smoothly then, the cub's resistance easing as Elias held steady, his palm a steady warmth against her muzzle. Jax captured it silently, the shutters click a ghost in the hush. As the fever broke slowly, her breaths deepening into sleep, Elias pulled back, hand marked with the faint damp of her touch. He sank against the wall, the weight of the choice settling like snow. He'd risked the line, and in doing so, glimpsed his own redemption in her survival. Outside, the sun broke through, gilding the treetops in hesitant gold. The reserve breathed with it, streams thawing under the light, but the cub's story lingered in the air, a quiet demand for more than survival, for the compassion that mended what was broken. Elias lingered too, the bond tightening like roots in frozen soil, unaware yet of the deeper why that would soon unravel everything. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and compassion can travel. The midday sun filtered through the rehab center's narrow windows, casting wavering patterns on the enclosure's mesh, like sunlight on rippling water. Elias sat on the edge of a metal stool just outside the barrier, his elbows on his knees, watching the cub's chest rise and fall in deeper, more even rhythms. The fever had ebbed after the antibiotics took hold, leaving her fur slightly damp from the exertion, her body slack in the nest of blankets that smelled faintly of pine shavings and warmth. Hours had slipped by in that watchful quiet, the center's hum a distant companion to the soft scratch of her claws against the padding as she shifted in her sleep. Elias's hand still tingled from the brief contact earlier, the memory of her warm breath against his skin lingering like a half-forgotten dream. Lena emerged from the supply room, wiping her hands on a towel, her face etched with the fatigue of a morning spent wrestling uncertainty. She paused beside him, glancing at the cub before settling into the chair opposite. "She's turning a corner," she said quietly, her voice threading through the stillness like a needle. "Core temps stabilizing, and that bonding, it's helping. Animals sense steadiness. You gave her that." Elias met her gaze, the words settling heavy in his chest. Steadiness. He'd lost that long ago, in the sterile quiet of a city hospital where promises dissolved into condolences. Out here, with the reserve's vast indifference, he'd rebuilt it in routines. Fence checks at dawn, reports filed under fluorescent lights. But this cub, with her insistent following through the snow, chipped at the facade. Outside, the reserve stirred under a hesitant thaw, snowmelt trickling from branches in silver threads that caught the light. Jax had lingered too, his camera now resting on the table like a silent witness, its lens pointed away for once. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the lines around his eyes deepening as he watched the scene. "Ever think about why she picked you?" he asked, breaking the hush. His tone wasn't probing, just the musing of a man who'd chased shadows across continents, only to find them in his own reflections. Elias shook his head, eyes fixed on the cub's twitching ear. "Instinct, probably. I was there. Closest thing to safety in the cold." But doubt gnawed at the edges. The cub had crossed boundaries no wild thing should, trailing him from the tree line, collapsing not in fear, but in quiet surrender. In his 15 years patrolling, he'd encountered black bears nosing trash bins, wolves skirting highways, but never this, a white tiger cub, rare as a winter aurora, weaving her path to his door. The reserve's logs showed no breaches, no signs of poachers in weeks. Lena had run preliminary tests, no trackers, no brands from illicit breeders, just a small, fierce survivor, her blue eyes holding secrets in their depths. As afternoon waned, the cub roused fully, her movements languid but purposeful. She rose on unsteady paws, circling the enclosure once before pressing her side against the mesh nearest Elias. Her breath fogged the wire in warm puffs, carrying the faint, wild scent of musk and earth. He leaned closer, the barrier a thin veil between worlds, and extended his fingers again through the slot. She nuzzled them this time, deliberate and gentle, her rough tongue rasping once against his skin before withdrawing. The touch sent a shiver through him, not from cold, but from the raw trust it implied, a bridge forged in vulnerability, fragile as the thawing ice outside. Lena observed from afar, her clipboard forgotten in her lap. In her years as vet, she'd seen bonds form, a deer fawn nursing from a bottle, an eagle returning to gloved hands. But this felt different, laced with the cub's unspoken urgency. "We should try feeding her," she suggested, signaling an assistant who approached with a shallow dish of softened meat laced with vitamins. The cub's head snapped toward the sound, ears forward, but her eyes flicked back to Elias as if seeking permission. He nodded faintly, murmuring low reassurances that blended with the room's quiet. She ate then, methodical bites that steadied her frame, her tail curling in subtle contentment. Word from Eldridge Hollow filtered in via a crackling radio on the counter. Townfolk gathering at the general store, voices laced with the familiar mix of awe and apprehension. Old Harlan's gruff tone cut through static. Rangers playing house with a killer's kin. One day it'll turn, mark my words. Sarah Klein, patching up a ranch hand's cut, added her quieter dissent over the line when Lena patched her in for advice. Just be careful, Doc. We've got enough hurt souls here without adding claws to the mix. The moral divide echoed in the air, fear versus the pull of compassion. The town's wary eyes on a man who'd always kept to the shadows. Jax broke the tension with a soft chuckle, though it held no mirth. They're scared of what they don't understand. Me? I've seen tigers in the wild. Majestic, yeah, but alone like this? It's a cry for something more. He picked up his camera, but hesitated, the shutter silent. His own failure in Asia weighed on him still. Shots of a mother tiger gunned down, her cub vanishing into the undergrowth. Documentation hadn't saved her. It had only immortalized the loss. Here, watching Elias's steady presence, Jax felt the stir of redemption. Not his own, but a shared one, born from choosing to witness rather than walk away. As evening crept in, painting the room in amber hues, the cub settled near the mesh, her body heat warming the air between them. Elias didn't move, the stool's discomfort forgotten in the rhythm of her breathing. But then, a faint tremor ran through her. A subtle shake, not fever, but something deeper, instinctive. She rose abruptly, pacing the enclosure's length, her paws padding softly, eyes wide and searching. A low, rumbling chuff escaped her, not distress but a call, echoing the weak roars Elias had imagined in the night. He pressed his palm flat against the wire, heart quickening. "What is it, girl?" The words hung unanswered, but her gaze locked on his, pleading in that silent language of the wild. Lena checked the monitors, brow furrowing. Stress? Or maybe she's sensing something outside. The reserve's edge loomed beyond the windows, twilight deepening the shadows where unseen paths wound through the pines. Elias stood, peering out, the cold glass fogging under his breath. In the distance, a faint rustle carried on the wind. Perhaps nothing, a deer in the brush, but it set his nerves alight. The cub pressed closer, her forehead bumping the mesh gently against his hand as if urging him to understand. In that moment, the bond tightened, a thread pulling taut across the divide. Elias felt the weight of it, not just her survival, but the why beneath her following, a desperation that mirrored his own buried longing for connection, for something to guard against the emptiness. He didn't know the full truth yet, the revelation that would unravel him, but as night fell, engines humming faintly from the highway, he sensed its approach, inevitable as the cub's quiet insistence. The reserve held its breath, the world narrowing to the space between man and beast, where compassion bloomed in the face of the unknown. The twilight deepened into a velvet hush over the rehab center, the kind that swallowed sounds whole and left only the pulse of the world beneath. Elias lingered by the window, his breath fogging the glass in uneven clouds, the faint rustle from the reserve's edge echoing in his ears like a half-heard warning. The cub paced her enclosure still, her white form a ghost in the dimming light, paws silent on the padded floor, but her body taut with an urgency that pressed against the mesh. Her sapphire eyes darted between Elias and the shadowed tree line beyond, chuffing low and insistent, a sound that vibrated through the air like a thread pulled tight. He felt it in his chest, that pull, a mirror to the restlessness that had driven him from the city, from the sterile quiet where grief had first taken root. Lena stepped closer, her movements measured, stethoscope dangling like a pendulum from her neck. She placed a hand on his shoulder, light but steady, her touch grounding in the swelling tension. "She's agitated," she murmured, eyes flicking to the monitors where the heart rate spiked in erratic peaks. "Not pain, Instinct, like she's calling to something out there. The assistant hovered nearby, clipboard clutched tight, knuckles paling against the paper. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the crisp bite of night through the pines. And with it, a distant, faint cry, raw and broken, not the cub's but something larger echoing from the forest's depths. Elias's throat tightened, the sound slicing through him like a cold blade. He knew the reserve's chorus, coyotes yipping at dusk, owls slicing the silence, but this was different, a weak, labored roar, muffled by distance and exhaustion. The cub froze mid-pace, ears flattening, then rose on her hind legs, front paws scrabbling against the enclosure as if to climb toward the noise. Her breaths came faster, fogging the wire in frantic bursts, and Elias knelt instinctively, his hand slipping through the slot once more. "Easy, girl," he whispered, voice rough with the strain of holding back his own rising fear. Her muzzle pressed against his palm, hot and urgent, her tongue flicking out in desperate reassurance, but her eyes stayed fixed on the window, pleading in that wordless way that stripped him bare. Jax shifted in the corner, camera forgotten on the table, his lean frame tense against the wall. He'd chased stories like this before, whispers of endangered lives in far-off jungles, but here, in the close confines of the center, it felt personal, the air thick with the weight of choices unmade. "That sound could be her mother," he said quietly, the words hanging like frost. Lena nodded, already pulling on her coat, the fabric rustling in the hush. "If it's the tigress, she's in bad shape to be calling like that. Weak, maybe injured. We can't ignore it." Her eyes met Elias's, a silent judgment passing between them. Protocol versus the pull of compassion, the risk of stepping into the wild's unforgiving embrace. The decision formed in the spaces between breaths, no grand declaration, just the quiet resolve that bloomed in moments like this. Elias stood, grabbing his pack from the hook by the door, the weight familiar against his shoulder. "I'll check the eastern perimeter. You two, get the truck ready." Lena hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she zipped her kit, the small shake betraying the fear she kept locked behind her calm. "Elias, it's dark, and if it's her, she won't take kindly to strangers." But he was already moving, the door creaking open to the chill night, the cub's whine following him like a shadow. The reserve swallowed him whole as he plunged into the tree line. Flashlight beam, cutting erratic paths through the underbrush. Snow crunched under his boots, the cold seeping through his jeans, but he pressed on, guided by the intermittent cries that grew fainter, more desperate with each gust of wind. Branches snagged at his jacket, the scent of wet fur and blood-tinged earth growing stronger, a primal pull that drowned out the rational voice urging retreat. His heart hammered, not from exertion, but from the echo of old losses, the empty nursery back in the city, the doctor's hand on his wife's shoulder, the silence that followed. Out here, survival demanded action, and for the first time in years, he felt the stir of purpose beyond mere patrol. Deeper in, where the pines thickened into a cathedral of shadow, the beam caught a flash of white, larger than the cub, slumped against a fallen log, her massive form heaving with labored breaths. The tigress, her coat matted and dull, blue eyes dim but fierce as they lifted to meet his. She didn't rise, couldn't, her body a testament to the toll of whatever hunt or flight had brought her low. Flanks rising sharply, ribs stark under the pale fur. She let out another weak roar, not threat but summons, her gaze locking on Elias with an intensity that rooted him in place. Up close, the vulnerability hit like a wave. This was no monster, but a mother stripped to instinct, her strength ebbing into the frozen ground. He knelt slowly, hands visible, palm up in the universal gesture of peace. The tigress's breath rasped, hot and ragged, carrying the metallic tang of exertion, but she didn't lunge. Instead, her head tilted, nostrils flaring as if scenting something beyond him. The cub, perhaps, or the safety he'd unwittingly offered. Elias's radio crackled faintly, Lena's voice cutting through. "Elias, trucks en route, hold position." But holding felt impossible. The tigress's eyes held a plea, mirroring the cub's, a silent justice in their depths that judged his worth not by badge or fence lines, but by the choice before him. Trembling hands fumbled for the trank gun at his belt, not to harm, but to ease the extraction, his fingers numb from cold and the surge of emotion. Tears pricked unbidden, blurring the beam as the pieces aligned. The cubs following, not random desperation, but a deliberate trail, leading him here to her kin. The tigress had driven her offspring toward the ranger's path, trusting instinct over isolation, her suffering a beacon in the dark. Elias's breath hitched, the weight of it crashing down, the redemption in saving not just one, but the thread binding them, a family forged in frost and fear. As the truck's headlights pierced the gloom, engines rumbling like distant thunder, the tigress's eyes softened fractionally, her massive head lowering in exhausted surrender. Elias whispered assurances, voice breaking on the edge of sob, the cold night wrapping around him like absolution. In that suspended breath, man and beast confronted the raw edge of morality, the bond extending beyond the cub to encompass the silent strength that had chosen him, revealing the depth of his own guarded heart. The reserve held its vigil, stars wheeling overhead as compassion bridged the divide, one fragile step at a time. The truck's headlights sliced through the encroaching night like hesitant beacons, illuminating the tigress's slumped form in stark relief against the shadowed log. Her white coat, once a pristine veil of majesty, hung in ragged waves, matted with the grime of her desperate trek through the underbrush. Elias remained kneeling, his breath sinking with hers in shallow, synchronized huffs that misted the frigid air between them. The trank gun felt heavy in his trembling hand, its barrel pointed low, not as a weapon, but a reluctant mercy to bridge the chaos of rescue. Her blue eyes, dulled by pain yet unyielding, held his, a silent pact forged in the wild's unforgiving grammar, where trust was a gamble against extinction. Lena's voice crackled over the radio again, sharper now with urgency. "Elias, we're 2 minutes out. Keep her calm. No sudden moves." The words barely registered. The world had narrowed to the tigress's labored rises, the faint tremor in her flanks as she shifted her weight, paws scraping weakly against the frozen earth. No roar escaped her this time, only a low, rumbling exhale that carried the weight of her exhaustion, like wind dying in the pines. Elias's throat burned, tears tracing cold paths down his cheeks, blurring the edges of her form. He'd pieced it together in that suspended moment, the cub's insistent following through the snow, not blind desperation, but a calculated instinct, her tiny body a messenger dispatched to summon aid for the one who'd birthed her into this harsh world. The engine's growl grew louder, tires churning over hidden roots as the truck burst into the clearing. Lena leaped out first, her kit thudding to the ground, followed by Jax and the assistant, their faces pale masks in the headlight glare. The air thickened with the scent of diesel and damp fur, the cold biting deeper as they approached in a cautious semicircle. Jax's camera hung forgotten at his side, his usual detachment shattered by the sight. The massive tigress, a symbol of untamed power, reduced to this vulnerability, her breaths rasping like pages turning in a forgotten book. "God," he whispered, voice lost to the wind, his hands clenching as if to steady the tremor of witnessing raw survival. Lena knelt beside Elias, her gloves snapping into place with practiced efficiency, eyes scanning the tigress's form. Dehydration. Exhaustion. Looks like she hasn't eaten in days. Possible internal injury from whatever drove her here. She moved slowly, syringe at the ready, her own breath hitching as the tigress's gaze flicked toward her, assessing, pleading in its quiet ferocity. The assistant unpacked the portable hoist, metal clinking softly in the hush, each sound drawing a faint ear twitch from the great cat. Elias didn't rise. He stayed grounded, palm extended, murmuring fragments of reassurance that blended with the night symphony. "Hold on. She's coming back to you." Words meant for both mother and the daughter waiting in the center's glow. The sedative whispered through the air, a dart finding its mark in the tigress's haunch with a soft thud. Her massive head lowered gradually, eyelids drooping as the tension bled from her limbs, her body slumping fully against the log, in a heap of pale fur and labored sighs. Tears streamed freely now for Elias, hot against the chill, his chest heaving with the release of it all. In her eyes, just before they closed, he'd seen the truth. The cub had chosen him not from chance, but from a deeper recognition, perhaps the scent of his solitary patrols, the steady rhythm of his steps that echoed a protector lost to her. The tigress had pushed her offspring towards safety, her suffering a deliberate sacrifice, forcing this human to confront the morality of inaction. They worked in orchestrated silence then, the team lifting her with the hoist, straps cradling her bulk as gently as possible, her weight pulled at the ropes, a reminder of her strength even in weakness, and Elias steadied the line, muscles straining, his gloved hands slick with sweat beneath the leather. Jax finally raised his camera, but the shots came slow, deliberate. Not exploitation, but testimony to the quiet heroism unfolding in the dark. Lena monitored her vitals en route back, the truck's cab filled with the beeps of portable machines and the low hum of the heater fighting the cold. "Pulse is thready," she said, voice tight, glancing at Elias in the rear view. "If she's been fighting infection like the cub, we might be looking at sepsis. Field surgery's our only shot tonight." The rehab center loomed ahead, its lights a fragile outpost against the enveloping night, engines cooling with a metallic sigh as they pulled into the lot. They wheeled the tigress into the treatment bay adjacent to the cub's enclosure, the air inside shifting with the influx of wild essence, musk and frost, mingling with antiseptic. Through the connecting window the cub stirred, her small form rising to press against the glass, ears perked at the faint sounds of her mother's arrival. A soft chuff escaped her, answered weakly by the tigress's sedated breaths, the reunion a thread of instinct weaving through barriers. Lena's hands trembled as she prepped the surgical field, scalpel glinting under the harsh lights, her face a canvas of held-back tears. "Elias, talk to her. Keep the cub calm too. Your voice. It's what they know now." He nodded, positioning himself between the enclosures, his words a low murmur that filled the room like a balm. The incision was precise. No gore, but the quiet revelation of strain. Inflamed tissues from exposure, a wound hidden beneath fur that spoke of a desperate evasion. Poacher's traps, perhaps, or a rival's mark. The tigress's chest rose unevenly under the monitors, her survival hinging on this intervention, the weight of it pressing on every soul in the room. Jax stood back, his breath shallow, the moral suspense coiling tighter. To save her meant risking the fragile balance of the reserve, inviting scrutiny from the town that viewed such creatures as threats unworthy of the cost. But in the tigress's steadying pulse, as sutures closed the hidden damage, redemption flickered. For Lena, absolving years of losses. For Jax, rewriting his archive of failures. For Elias, mending the hollow left by his own unspoken grief. The cub watched through the glass, her eyes mirroring her mother's, pleading, trusting, as the night deepened outside, highways empty and stars indifferent. Hours blurred into a vigil of beeps and whispers, the tigress stabilizing under layers of warmth and fluids, her breaths deepening into the promise of dawn. Elias collapsed into a chair, exhaustion carving lines into his face, but his hand rested against the cub's mesh, a conduit to the family he'd unwittingly become guardian of. The why of it all settled deeper now. Not fully unveiled, but pressing close, a revelation born from suffering that demanded his tears, his action, his humanity. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. The first light of dawn seeped through the rehab center's blinds, painting the treatment bay in soft grays that softened the edges of exhaustion. The tigress lay still under the surgical drapes, her massive chest rising in steady swells, the monitor's beeps a quiet metronome marking her fragile hold on life. Elias slumped in the chair between the enclosures, his eyes heavy-lidded, but fixed on the connecting window where the cub mirrored her mother's form, curled yet alert, her sapphire gaze never straying far from the barrier. The air hung thick with the residue of the night's ordeal, faint traces of antiseptic, the earthy warmth of fur, and the unspoken relief that clung like dew. Outside, the reserve stirred faintly, birdsong threading through the pines as snowmelt dripped from eaves, a tentative thaw after the freeze. Lena moved like a shadow in the dimness, checking sutures with gloved hands that no longer trembled. She paused by the tigress's side, stethoscope hovering, her face etched with the quiet triumph of survival snatched from the brink. "She's through the worst," she whispered, more to the room than anyone, her voice a thread in the hush. Infections contained, vitals holding, but recovery, it'll be slow. Weeks, maybe months, before she's strong enough for release. Elias nodded, the words settling over him like a heavy blanket, his fingers still pressed against the cub's mesh. The small cat nuzzled closer, her breath warm through the wire, a silent affirmation that bound them in the pre-dawn quiet. Jax lingered in the corner, his camera set aside on a counter cluttered with empty vials and charts, the lens fogged from the room's humidity. He'd captured fragments of the surgery, blurred edges of light on pale fur, hands steady in crisis, but now he watched without intrusion, the weight of the night pressing on his shoulders. His own shadows loomed larger here, the Asian jungle where he'd arrived too late, the tigress's lifeless eyes staring through his viewfinder. This one breathed, her presence a quiet rebuke to inaction, forcing him to confront the redemption in witnessing without exploiting. He shifted, boots scuffing softly on the linoleum, but said nothing, the silence a shared vigil. As the sun crested fully, gilding the treetops beyond the windows, the cub let out a soft chuff, her body uncoiling to pace the enclosure's length. Elias rose, joints protesting the night's immobility, and approached the tigress's bay. Through the haze of fatigue, details sharpened. The faint scars hidden beneath her fur, old and faded, but the fresh wound from surgery revealed more. A jagged tear, not from claws or traps, but something deliberate, human. Lena had cleaned it under the lights, murmuring about barbs and wire, but now, in the morning's clarity, Elias leaned closer, heart quickening. The mark aligned with reports he'd filed months back. Poacher snares near the eastern fence, dismantled but not before claiming lives unseen. The realization uncoiled slowly, like roots breaking frozen soil. He remembered a patrol last fall, the air crisp with autumn's bite, when he'd heard a distant roar, fierce, protective, while freeing a snared deer from the underbrush. He'd lingered then, flashlight sweeping shadows, catching a glimpse of white fur retreating into the gloom. The tigress, blue eyes flashing warning, her cub's tiny form tucked behind her. No confrontation, just a moment of crossed paths, his steady hands and quiet retreat imprinting on her instinct. The cub hadn't followed him by chance. She'd led him here, her weak steps through the snow, a deliberate echo of that encounter, scenting the man who'd spared her family once before. The tigress had pushed her towards safety, her own body, the shield against the hunter's shadows. suffering in silence to guide her daughter to the one human whose presence whispered of mercy. Elias's breath hitched, a sob building in his chest like a storm long held back. He sank to his knees beside the enclosure, forehead pressing against the cool mesh, tears spilling hot and unchecked down his cheeks, the grief he'd buried, the empty ache of the child lost before breath. The divorce's hollow echo, the years of solitary patrols masking isolation, surfaced in that flood, mingling with awe at the tigress's unspoken faith. She'd chosen him not from desperation alone, but recognition, a guardian in the wild's vast indifference, his compassion a beacon her instincts had trusted. The cub whined softly through the wire, her paw batting gently at his fingers, while the tigress stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering as if sensing the unraveling. In her eyes, when they opened to slits, there was no judgment, only the quiet justice of survival shared, her bond with him forged in the raw vulnerability of need. Lena approached then, her hand resting on his shoulder, tears glinting in her own eyes as the truth rippled through the room. She knew, she said simply, voice thick, the words a bridge across the divide. Jax exhaled sharply, turning away to wipe his face, the camera's weight forgotten in the face of such silent connection. The town of Eldridge Hollow would murmur later. Harlan's gruff doubts at the diner, Sarah's quiet advocacy at the clinic. But in this moment, the moral suspense dissolved into redemption. Elias, once hollowed by loss, now whole in the act of saving what had sought him out. His tears fell like rain on parched earth, washing away the barriers, revealing the man beneath the ranger's guise, one capable of loyalty beyond species, instinct answering instinct in the hush of dawn. Days blurred into weeks, the center a sanctuary of measured progress. The tigress gained strength under Lena's care, her movements regaining fluid grace while the cub grew bolder, her playful pounces against the mesh, drawing faint smiles from the team. Elias visited daily, his patrols now laced with purpose, the reserve's paths feeling less like isolation and more like guardianship. Jax's photos circulated quietly, images of white fur against snow, eyes meeting across barriers, raising funds for stronger fences, turning documentation into quiet advocacy. The bond deepened in silences, shared breaths through wire, the tigress's low rumble answering Elias's murmurs, the cub's tail flicking in rhythm with his steps. One crisp morning, as frost yielded to spring's whisper, release came. The team gathered at the reserve's edge, engines idling softly in the distance, the highway a faint ribbon beyond the trees. The tigress stepped from the crate first, her coat gleaming anew, muscles rippling under pale fur as she scented the air. The cub followed, tumbling out with a joyful bound, nuzzling her mother's flank in a tangle of white. They paused, turning as one to Elias, blue eyes locking in that piercing gaze, gratitude unspoken, a final plea fulfilled. He knelt, hand extended one last time, tears pricking anew but held back, his heart mended in the weight of their trust. Then, with a shared chuff that echoed through the pines, they melted into the forest, mother and cub vanishing into the underbrush like mist at sunrise. Elias watched until the tree line swallowed them, the sun warming his back, the world vast and alive. In the quiet aftermath, compassion lingered, not as a fleeting act, but an enduring truth, survival woven from choices, instinct bridging the wild and the wounded heart. The reserve breathed on, dust settling on empty highways, cold mornings yielding to hope, a reminder that kindness once given echoes beyond the horizon. A white tiger walking into the horizon with her cubs, their forms fading into gold. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching. The case of White Tiger Cub keeps following Ranger. When he finds out why, he cries. See you in the next one.